My husband stood there silently while his mother tore me to shreds in front of the entire family, calling me incompetent and saying I wasn't good enough for her son. But when I finally uncovered the dirty secret he and my mother-in-law had been hiding from me for years, my revenge was so perfect that they begged for my forgiveness on their knees. And what happened after that changed our lives forever in a way no one could have ever imagined. I was standing in the dining room of my mother-in-law's house, my trembling hands holding a porcelain plate I had just dropped, the shards scattered at my feet like pieces of my own dignity. And she was there, barely a foot away, her finger pointed right at my face, screaming that I was useless, that she'd never seen such a clumsy and incompetent woman, that her son deserved better, someone who could at least hold a plate properly. And her voice echoed through the entire house while the whole family was gathered around the table, sisters-in-law, brothers-in-law, nieces and nephews, all in an awkward silence, looking at me with that mix of pity and discomfort. And I felt my face burning with shame, the tears starting to sting my eyes, but I couldn't cry. Not there, not in front of everyone. And then my eyes automatically sought out my husband, Luke, who was sitting at the head of the table next to his mother. And he wasn't even looking at me, his eyes fixed on the plate of food in front of him, shuffling his fork back and forth as if nothing was happening, as if his own wife wasn't being publicly humiliated by his own mother. And it was in that moment, in that exact second, I realized he wasn't going to say a word, that he was going to let this happen again, that something inside me simply broke. It wasn't like the other times when I'd swallow my tears and pretend everything was fine. This time was different, because as my mother-in-law continued her tirade about how I couldn't cook, couldn't clean, couldn't be a real wife, I looked at my husband, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I saw him for who he truly was, a coward, a 32-year-old man who was still afraid to stand up to his mother, who would rather see me suffer than have to confront that woman. My mother-in-law finished her speech with a venomous comment that she had warned her son that marrying me would be a mistake, that he hadn't listened and now he was paying the price. Finally, she turned and went back to the kitchen, leaving a deathly silence in the room. And I just stood there, surrounded by the broken pieces of the plate, feeling everyone's eyes on me, waiting for Luke to say something, anything. But he just cleared his throat, picked up his glass of water, and took a slow sip, as if nothing had happened. It was the youngest sister-in-law, Megan, who finally broke the silence, quietly saying she would go get the broom. I knelt down to start gathering the shards with hands that were shaking so badly I almost cut myself. And no one helped me. No one said a thing. When I finally finished cleaning everything up and returned to the table, the conversation had already started up again, as if those 5 minutes of humiliation had never existed. But I knew this couldn't go on, that something had to change, because I couldn't bear to live like that anymore, being treated as less than nothing in my own family. Or rather, in my husband's family, because it had certainly never been my real family. And the worst part wasn't even my mother-in-law's yelling. It was Luke's silence. It was knowing that the man who had sworn to love and protect me wouldn't lift a finger when I needed him most. And that night, while everyone ate dessert and laughed at jokes I wasn't even listening to, I made a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, I still had no idea just how far I would be willing to go to reclaim my dignity and get justice for what they had put me through for all those years. Before we go on, I want to take a moment to thank every single one of you watching, because sharing this story isn't easy for me. In fact, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I know that so many of you, maybe even most of you, have been through something similar. You felt invisible in your own marriage. You've been disrespected by an in law and watched your partner stay silent. And that's why I'm sharing my story, so you know you're not alone, that there is a way out, even when it feels like there isn't. So, if you're enjoying this content and want to keep getting real stories like this one, stories of overcoming, of women who found their strength when all seemed lost, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. And if you could leave a like, it really helps the video reach other people who need to hear this message. And I read every single comment, absolutely all of them. So feel free to share your own experience if you're comfortable, because this is a supportive community where there's no judgment, where we all understand each other's pain. And now, let's get back to my story, because what happened that night was just the beginning. And for you to fully understand how we got to that point, to that horrible dinner where I finally saw the truth, I need to go back a few years and tell you how it all began. How I met Luke, how I fell in love with him, and how the kind and caring man who won me over slowly transformed into someone I could barely recognize. So take a deep breath with me, because this is going to be an intense journey. It's going to stir your emotions, but I promise you it's worth sticking around until the end. Because what happened after that dinner, the way I finally reclaimed my dignity and completely turned the tables, was something I never even thought I'd be capable of. I met Luke 6 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party, and honestly, it was love at first sight, at least for me. He was everything I had ever dreamed of in a man: tall, handsome, with a smile that could light up the entire room. He was so kind, so attentive. We spent the whole night talking in a corner of that party, forgetting anyone else was around. He told me about his job as a civil engineer, about his dreams of one day starting his own company, and I told him about my career as an elementary school teacher, about how much I loved working with children. At the end of the night, he asked for my number and said he wanted to see me again. I floated home that night, thinking I had found the man of my life. And for the first 6 months of our relationship, that's exactly how it was. He was the perfect boyfriend, picking me up from work every Friday with flowers, planning romantic dates, introducing me to his friends and colleagues. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. He told me every day that he loved me, that I was special, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. And I believed every word, because there was no reason not to. But then came the day I met his family, and that's when things started to get strange. His mother, Eleanor, welcomed me into her home with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She greeted me far too formally, as if I were a stranger invading her territory. Throughout the lunch, she asked questions that seemed innocent but were laced with venom. About my family, my parents' professions, where I went to college. When I mentioned I'd graduated from a state university and not some expensive private one, I saw the look she exchanged with her eldest daughter, Beatrice, a look that clearly said I wasn't good enough for her precious son. But Luke didn't notice a thing, or pretended not to. He was so happy to be introducing me to his family that he missed the tension, or maybe he just didn't want to see it. When we left, he asked what I thought of his mother, and I lied, saying she was great, because I didn't want to cause trouble so early on. That was the first of many, many lies I would tell to keep the peace. But Eleanor made it clear from that very first day that I wasn't welcome, that she had different expectations for her son. In the following months, whenever we visited his family, she found subtle ways to belittle me. She would praise other women in front of Luke, talking about how successful they were, how they came from good families, how they knew how to cook sophisticated dishes, always ending with a seemingly casual comment about how important it was for a wife to know how to properly care for her husband. Luke would listen to all of it and smile, as if they were just motherly advice, as if they weren't barbs aimed directly at me. Still, I stayed, because I loved Luke and thought that with time, Eleanor would accept me, that she would see I truly loved her son and wanted to make him happy. So when Luke proposed a year after we started dating, I said yes without hesitation. It was the happiest day of my life. Or it should have been. Because when we told his family, Eleanor showed no joy. She simply said it was too soon, that Luke should wait, build his career more before getting married. For the first time, I saw Luke confront his mother. He said he was sure that I was the right woman, that he loved me and was going to marry me with or without her approval. For a moment, I thought everything would be okay, that he would always defend me like that. But it was just an illusion. Eleanor is a very smart, very manipulative woman. She didn't fight, didn't make a scene. She simply sighed and said she only wanted her son's happiness, that if he was sure, then she would support him. But I saw in her eyes that it was far from over. The wedding was beautiful, a little smaller than I had dreamed because money was tight and Eleanor refused to help financially, saying that if Luke wanted to get married against her advice, he could pay for it all himself. Still, it was a magical day. The honeymoon was perfect. 15 days, just the two of us on a paradise beach, and I truly believed we would be happy forever. But when we returned and started our life together in our small but cozy rented apartment, things began to change. Eleanor called Luke every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, always with some excuse. She needed him to come to her house to fix something, or she just wanted to see him because she missed him. And Luke always went, dropping whatever he was doing, letting dinners I had prepared grow cold on the table to rush to his mother's side. When I complained, he said she was getting older, that he was the only son, that it was his responsibility to take care of her. I tried to understand, tried to be compassionate, but it was hard when she was clearly using these excuses to keep us apart, to keep Luke tied to her. Then came the mandatory Sunday lunches at her house, every week without fail. I hated those lunches because Eleanor always found something to criticize about me. The way I'd done my hair, the outfit I was wearing, the fact I was 5 minutes late because of traffic, everything was grounds for a sharp comment. And Luke would sit there silently, eating his food, avoiding conflict. Later in the car, he'd ask me not to take it personally, saying his mom was just like that I needed to be patient, that she'd get better with time. But she never got better. She only got worse. The more she realized Luke wouldn't defend me, the bolder she became with her criticism. Beatrice, his sister, started treating me poorly too, following her mother's lead, making comments about how I was different from the other wives in the family, how I didn't fit in. And then there was the middle sister-in-law, Jessica, who was married to Luke's older brother. She was always neutral, never defending me, but never attacking me either, just watching everything with the look of someone who had been through it all before and had given up fighting. That scared me, because I saw my future in her if I didn't do something. A faded woman with no voice, who had accepted being treated like a second-class citizen by her husband's family. I swore to myself I wouldn't let that happen to me. But slowly, week by week, month by month, I felt my resistance wearing down. Each criticism was like a drop of water. Alone, they didn't seem like much, but together they were forming an ocean that was drowning me. Luke changed too. The man who had been so affectionate and attentive at the beginning of our relationship became distant, always tired from work, always with his mind elsewhere. Our intimate life grew cold. Fewer kisses, fewer hugs, fewer deep conversations. When I tried to talk about it, He'd say it was just a phase, that every marriage went through it, that I was being dramatic. That word, dramatic, became his favorite whenever I tried to express how I was feeling. If I complained about his mother, I was dramatic. If I asked for more attention, I was needy and dramatic. If I cried, I was too emotional and dramatic. I started to question my own sanity, to think that maybe he was right. Maybe I really was overreacting. He always had a logical explanation for everything, saying his mother didn't have bad intentions, that I was misinterpreting things, that if I changed my attitude, Eleanor would change hers too. So I tried. I tried so hard to be the perfect daughter in law. I learned special recipes to cook for Sunday lunches. I dressed with even more care. I smiled and swallowed every single criticism. But nothing I did was ever enough, because the problem was never me. The problem was that Eleanor simply didn't want to accept me. She wanted her son to have married someone else, someone she had chosen. And since she couldn't undo the marriage, she decided to make my life a living hell until I gave up and left. And it almost worked. There was a time, in our third year of marriage, when I was seriously considering a separation. But then I found out I was pregnant, and everything changed. Suddenly, there was new hope, a baby that would unite our family, that would make Luke finally grow up and set boundaries with his mother. When we told everyone, even Eleanor seemed happy. She hugged Luke with tears in her eyes, saying she had always dreamed of being a grandmother. For a brief moment, I thought this would change everything. But 15 days later, I lost the baby. It was a miscarriage in the middle of the night. Bleeding, pain, a desperate rush to the hospital, and the most devastating loss of my life. Luke was sad, of course, but not shattered like I was. He said we were young, we'd have other children, that it was better it happened early. I couldn't believe his coldness. When we came back from the doctor's appointment that confirmed there was no longer a heartbeat, he went straight to his mother's house for comfort, leaving me alone in the apartment with my grief. When he returned hours later, he said Eleanor had mentioned that maybe it was a sign, that maybe it wasn't the right time for children. That broke me in a way I can't even describe. Instead of comforting me, instead of being by my side, he was at his mother's house listening to her plant doubts about whether I was even capable of being a mother. It was around that time that I started to shut down emotionally. I built walls around myself, stopped sharing my feelings with Luke because I knew he wouldn't understand, wouldn't support me. Our relationship became an empty shell. We lived together, but we were no longer partners. We were just two people sharing the same space. The Sunday lunches continued, Eleanor's criticism continued, and Luke's silence continued. I was dying a little inside each day until we reached that fateful dinner I described at the beginning. The day I dropped the plate and she humiliated me in front of everyone, and he said absolutely nothing. It was that night, lying alone in bed because Luke had stayed behind to drink with his brothers after dinner, that I finally realized I either had to act or I would wither away completely, become a shadow. And that's when everything started to change. The change didn't happen overnight. It was a process that began the morning after that horrible dinner, when I woke up with my eyes swollen from crying, and Luke had already left for work without even waking me to say goodbye. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding all this time. Do I really want to live like this for the rest of my life? And the answer came clear and immediate. No. No, I don't. No, I can't. No, I won't. It was like a switch had been flipped inside me. Suddenly, I was no longer willing to accept this treatment, no longer willing to be the passive victim of the situation. I got out of bed with a determination I hadn't felt in years, took a shower, got dressed, and instead of going straight to the school where I worked, I called in sick. I spent the entire day thinking, analyzing my situation from every possible angle. The more I thought, the more I realized there was something deeply wrong beyond the obvious criticisms and humiliations. There was something between the lines I had never truly paid attention to. The way Eleanor controlled every aspect of Luke's life, the way she always knew everything about our lives, even when we told her nothing, the way Luke's behavior completely changed when he was around his mother, becoming submissive and infantile. I started to wonder what other secrets that family was hiding, because families that function so dysfunctionally always have secrets, always have skeletons in the closet. I decided it was time to find out what those skeletons were. So I began to investigate, discreetly. The first thing I did was finally have a real conversation with Jessica, the neutral sister-in-law, the one who always watched everything in silence. I arranged to have coffee with her one afternoon when I knew Eleanor and Beatrice were busy. When we sat down at the cafe, far from the family's eyes and ears, I just asked her directly, "Jessica, what is really going on in this family? What do you all know that I don't?" She looked at me, surprised, then glanced around as if afraid of being overheard, and said quietly that she shouldn't say anything, that she had promised never to speak of it. But I insisted. I told her I was at my breaking point, that either she told me the truth or I was going to walk away from that family without understanding anything. Maybe it was the sincerity in my voice, or maybe she was also tired of carrying that weight alone, but she finally spoke. And what she told me that afternoon changed everything. She said that in the first few years of her marriage to Robert, Luke's older brother, she had gone through the exact same hell I was going through, the same criticisms, the same humiliations. When she was pregnant with their first child, Eleanor had made such cruel comments about her being unfit to be a mother that Jessica had developed severe postpartum depression. Instead of helping, Eleanor had used it as proof that she had been right, that Jessica was weak and unstable. And Robert, just like Luke, had never defended his wife, always siding with his mother. Jessica told me she had tried to leave once, had packed her bags and gone to her parents' house, but Robert had come for her, promising he would change, that he would set boundaries with his mother. She had believed him and gone back, but nothing changed. She had simply given up fighting and accepted that life. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. She said there was a reason Eleanor was so controlling with her sons, especially Luke, and that reason had to do with money. A lot of money. When I asked her to explain, she looked around once more and whispered that Luke and Robert's father, Mr. Anthony, who had passed away 6 years before I met Luke, had left a considerable inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a significant amount in properties and investments. According to the will, this inheritance was to be divided among the 3 children when the youngest turned 30, which in Luke's case had happened 2 years ago, right after we got married. But Eleanor, using the fact that she was the executor of the estate, had managed to indefinitely postpone the distribution of the inheritance, always with excuses about bureaucratic issues and taxes. She maintained total control over everything, deciding how much of an allowance to give each adult son. Both Luke and Robert were financially dependent on her in ways I couldn't even imagine. That explained so much. It explained why Luke could never say no to his mother, why he was always worried about pleasing her, why he was so afraid to cross her. It wasn't just a psychological issue of a son seeking maternal approval. It was a real, concrete financial dependency. Jessica told me she had discovered all of this years ago when she accidentally saw some documents at Eleanor's house. When she had confronted Robert, he had confirmed everything, but begged her never to mention it, because he was ashamed to admit that at 40 years old, he was still being supported by his mother. In that moment, everything clicked into place in my head. All the strange behaviors, all the inconsistencies, the way Luke always said he was saving up to start his own company but never had enough money, the way he got anxious at the end of the month waiting for his mother's transfer, which he claimed was an investment his father had left, but was actually just Eleanor controlling her sons through money. When I left that cafe after thanking Jessica profusely for trusting me, my head was spinning with all this information. Instead of going home, I went to a public library and spent hours researching estates, wills, legal deadlines, and heirs' rights. I discovered that what Eleanor was doing was completely illegal, that she couldn't just hold on to the inheritance indefinitely, that her sons had the right to demand its distribution. It was there, sitting in that library surrounded by law books, that my plan began to take shape. I wasn't just going to get revenge for the humiliations. I was going to free Luke and his brothers from Eleanor's toxic control. I was going to cut the strings she used to manipulate them. And in doing so, I would force Luke to finally grow up, a real man, a real husband. Or I would find out he was a lost cause, and then I would know it was time to leave. But either way, I would no longer be that passive woman who took everything in silence. In the following days, I became a detective. I started paying attention to every detail, every conversation, every piece of paper that passed through my hands. Luke didn't notice a thing because he barely even looked at me anymore, so accustomed to my silent presence that he didn't see when I began to change, when I started asking different questions, when I started observing everything with new eyes. A week after that coffee with Jessica, I got my big break. Eleanor asked us to fetch some old boxes from her attic, things belonging to the late Mr. Anthony that she wanted to organize. While Luke was downstairs talking to his mother, I went up to the attic and started searching. I found a box full of documents, certificates, property deeds, old bank statements, and in the middle of it all, I found a copy of Mr. Anthony's will. When I read that document, I saw it clearly written that the inheritance was to be divided equally among the 3 children as soon as the youngest turned 30, with no room for interpretation, no loophole for postponement. I also found correspondence from a lawyer sent years ago to Eleanor, informing her of the legal deadlines and requesting action for the distribution, letters she had clearly ignored. With my heart pounding, I took photos of all those documents with my phone, page by page, and put everything back exactly as it was. When I came down from the attic carrying the boxes Eleanor had asked for, my hands were trembling, but I kept my face neutral. I smiled at her as I always did, and we left. That night, after Luke was asleep, I transferred all the photos to a flash drive that I hid in the back of my lingerie drawer. Then I began the second phase of my plan. I needed professional help, someone who understood family and inheritance law. So the next day, during my lunch break at school, I went to a law firm a coworker had recommended years ago when she got divorced, and I requested an urgent consultation. When I sat down in front of Mr. Miller, a lawyer in his 50s with the look of a man who had seen it all, I just poured out the entire story. I showed him the photos of the documents, told him about Eleanor's control, the son's financial dependency, everything. He listened in silence, analyzing each document. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, I had a clear case of embezzlement of an inheritance, that Eleanor was committing a crime by illegally withholding the portion that belonged to her sons. He said it was grounds not only for a civil lawsuit, but also a criminal one. He told me that if the sons wanted to, they could file a lawsuit and recover everything that was rightfully theirs, including adjustments for inflation and interest for the time she had improperly held the money. When I asked how long the process would take, he said it would depend on several factors, but that with the documents I had, with such clear proof, perhaps less than a year. It was then that I made the most important decision. I told Mr. Miller I wanted him to prepare all the necessary documentation to compile a complete report on the situation, but that I didn't want to file the lawsuit yet. I wanted to use it as ammunition in a direct confrontation. I wanted to give Luke one last chance to choose the right side, to finally be my true partner. The lawyer warned me that this was risky, that it would be better to just sue and let the justice system handle it, but I insisted. I needed to know if there was anything in my marriage worth saving, if Luke had the capacity for change within him, or if I was married to a man who was simply an extension of his mother. Mr. Miller agreed. He said he would prepare everything and call me in 2 weeks when it was ready. I left that office feeling for the first time in years that I had power. I was no longer the helpless victim. I had information, I had proof, I had a plan. Now it was just a matter of choosing the right moment to act. While I waited for the lawyer to finalize the documents, I continued my life as usual, or at least it appeared that way. I kept going to Sunday munches, kept smiling and accepting Eleanor's criticisms, but inside, I was different. Every insult she threw at me, I stored away as another item on the list of reasons she deserved what was coming. Luke noticed nothing. He continued living his life as always, going to work, coming home tired, spending weekends at his mother's house. I watched him with a mixture of pity and anger. Pity because he was a grown man, still controlled like a puppet, and anger because he had chosen this. He had chosen to be weak, chosen to sacrifice our relationship to keep the peace with his mother. The day came when Mr. Miller called, saying everything was ready. He had prepared a complete dossier with all the evidence, legal analyses, and all the possible consequences for Eleanor if her sons decided to sue. I arranged to pick it all up from his office in person. When I held that thick folder full of documents, I felt an immense power, because I held in my hands the key to completely destroying the empire of control Eleanor had built. Now, I just had to decide how and when to use this weapon. The perfect opportunity arose 3 days later, when Eleanor announced she was hosting a special lunch for her birthday and expected all her children and their spouses to be present. I knew that would be the perfect stage for my revenge. Where it had all begun, at the dining table in that house, was where it would all end. I began to prepare every detail for that day, because when I confronted Eleanor and Luke, when I finally revealed everything I knew, I wanted it to be devastating, final, with no turning back. In the nights leading up to that birthday lunch, I could barely sleep from anxiety, but it wasn't the anxiety of fear. It was the anxiety of someone about to finally have their revenge after years of suffering. I knew that after that day, nothing would ever be the same. Either my marriage would finally transform into something real and healthy, or it would end for good. But either way, I would no longer be the woman who allowed herself to be walked all over. And with that thought, I fell asleep the night before Eleanor's birthday, holding that folder of documents hidden under my mattress, ready for the day that would change everything. The day of Eleanor's birthday dawned bright and sunny. I woke up before my alarm, my heart racing but my mind clear. I spent the entire morning preparing, not just physically but mentally, repeating over and over in my head exactly what I was going to say, how I was going to say it. I visualized every possible scenario, every reaction they might have, and I prepared for them all. When Luke woke up, he saw me already dressed in a navy blue dress that I knew looked good on me, my hair in an elegant bun, my makeup light but flawless. He commented, surprised, that I looked beautiful. It was the first time in months he had really looked at me. I just smiled and said it was his mother's birthday, that I wanted to look presentable. He seemed satisfied with the answer and went to take a shower, never imagining that I had dressed up not to impress Eleanor, but because when you go into battle, you dress like a warrior. And in the purse I was carrying, hidden at the bottom beneath tissues and lipstick, was the folder with all the documents, all the proof, all the ammunition I needed. When we arrived at Eleanor's house at 11 in the morning, she was in the kitchen overseeing the maids preparing lunch. She greeted me with that same fake smile as always, and I returned it with an equally fake one. For the first time, I didn't feel the usual anxiety, the tightness in my stomach, because I knew that in a few hours, she would be the one feeling anxious. She would be the one on the defensive. I went to help in the kitchen as I always did, peeling potatoes, arranging serving dishes, listening to Eleanor give orders to everyone. I observed the dynamics of that family with new eyes. Robert arrived with Jessica and their 2 children, and Jessica shot me a quick glance. I could tell she knew something was about to happen. I had sent her a text a few days before, letting her know I was going to act and thanking her for the information. She had replied with just a flexing bicep emoji. Beatrice arrived with her husband and their 3 children, arrogant as ever, making comments about how beautiful the house was, how her mother had such good taste, throwing indirect jabs about how some people couldn't appreciate nice things, looking in my direction as she said it. I just smiled and agreed because I could afford to be magnanimous, knowing what was coming. When we finally all sat down at the table, 13 of us in total, including the children, Eleanor was beaming, seated at the head with Luke on one side and Robert on the other, her 2 sons, her princes. She made a toast, thanking everyone for being there, saying how blessed she was to have such a beautiful family. Everyone raised their glasses and toasted, and I toasted too, but inside, I was counting down the minutes, waiting for the right moment. The lunch proceeded normally, the food was good, the conversations were superficial, the grandkids played and made noise, and it all looked like a perfect scene of a happy family. But I knew it was all a facade, that behind those smiles were years of manipulation and control. When we finished the main course and the maids began to clear the plates to bring out dessert, Eleanor announced she had an important announcement to make. Everyone fell silent, paying attention. She said she had decided to sell one of the properties that had belonged to her late husband, a piece of land in a prime area worth a lot of money, and that she was going to use the money to renovate her house and take a trip to Europe. She said it so casually, as if that property was hers alone, as if she could do whatever she wanted with the assets that legally belonged to her 3 children. I saw Robert and Luke exchange uncomfortable glances, but neither said a word. Beatrice clapped her hands excitedly, saying her mother deserved it, that she should enjoy her life. And it was in that moment that I decided it was time. I wasn't going to let her do this, wasn't going to let her continue to steal from her own children. I took a deep breath, placed my wine glass gently on the table, and said in a clear voice that caught everyone's attention, "Eleanor, before you sell that property, I think we need to talk about something very important." The silence that fell was absolute. Even the children stopped making noise, sensing the tension in the air. Eleanor looked at me with an expression of disdain mixed with surprise, as if she couldn't believe I had dared to interrupt her. She said in a cutting voice, "Talk about what exactly?" I held her gaze firmly and said, "About Mr. Anthony's inheritance, about his will, about the fact that you have been illegally withholding the portion that belongs to your children for over 3 years. The reaction was immediate. Eleanor turned pale. Robert choked on his wine. Luke turned to me with wide eyes. Beatrice dropped her fork on her plate, and Jessica tried to hide a small smile. Eleanor quickly composed herself and said I didn't know what I was talking about, that I was being disrespectful on her birthday. Luke put his hand on my arm, trying to make me stop, whispering for me not to do this. But I shook him off and continued. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I grabbed my purse from under the chair, took out the folder of documents, and placed it on the table. I have here a copy of Mr. Anthony's will, copies of letters from lawyers that you ignored, and a complete legal report showing that what you're doing is the crime of embezzlement. I opened the folder and began to distribute copies of the main documents to Luke, Robert, and Beatrice. As they read, their expressions changed from confusion to shock to anger. Luke looked at his mother and asked in a tone I had never heard before, "Mom, is this true? You've been holding our inheritance?" Eleanor tried to defend herself, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just waiting for the right moment, that there were complex bureaucratic issues. But I interrupted her, showing one of the documents. There's nothing complex. It's all very clear right here. Mr. Anthony left explicit instructions that the inheritance should be divided when Luke turned 30. That was 3 years ago. And ever since, you've been using the money and properties as if they were your own, giving your adult sons allowances to keep them dependent and under your control. Robert stood up from his chair, his face red, and shouted, "Mom, is that why you always said you couldn't help me more financially? That Dad's money was invested and couldn't be touched, but the whole time you had access to everything?" Beatrice was also reading the documents with tears in her eyes as she realized she had been deceived too, that she was entitled to much more than her mother had let her believe. Eleanor tried to regain control of the situation. She slammed her hand on the table and said, I was a meddler, that I had no right to interfere in her family's affairs, that I should have stayed in my place. And that's when Luke did something I never thought I would see. He stood up, positioned himself between me and his mother, and said with a firm voice, "No, Mom, you're the one who should have stayed in your place. You had no right to do this to us, to lie, to manipulate, to control our lives like this." Seeing Luke finally confront his mother after all those years was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But Eleanor wasn't one to give up easily. She pointed her finger at me and said it was all my fault, that I had poisoned her son's mind, that since I entered this family, I had brought nothing but trouble. Luke was about to respond, but I held his arm and said calmly, "Eleanor, you can blame me all you want, but that doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change the law. And it doesn't change what I'm going to do now." I took another document from the folder, Mr. Miller's report on the possible legal actions. This document here details all the legal options your children have. They can file a civil suit to recover the inheritance, they can file a criminal complaint for embezzlement, or, I paused dramatically, or you can do the right thing for the first time in years and sign the voluntary distribution documents that my lawyer has already prepared. I placed another set of papers on the table. Eleanor looked at those documents as if they were venomous snakes and said she would never sign anything, that I couldn't force her. I smiled and said, "No, I can't, but a judge can. And I'm sure that when he sees all this evidence, in addition to ordering the immediate distribution, he will also investigate what you did with the income from these properties over the last 3 years, where that money went, and if you used it for your own benefit, as it appears you did, the consequences could be quite serious." I saw fear flash in her eyes for the first time. She realized she no longer had control of the situation, that I had completely turned the tables. Robert picked up the distribution documents and began to read, then said he would sign, that he wanted his share of the inheritance, that he wanted to finally be free. Luke also took the papers and agreed. Beatrice, always her mother's favorite, was torn, looking at Eleanor with tears in her eyes, but also clutching the documents tightly. Eleanor realized she was losing. She tried to appeal to their emotions, starting to cry, saying she had done everything for her children, that she was only trying to protect their late father's assets, that they were ungrateful. But no one was buying that story anymore. Her children had seen the proof in black and white. Robert said she had two options: either sign the voluntary distribution right then and there, or they would file a lawsuit on Monday morning. And if she chose the second option, everything would become public. All their friends, their church, their neighbors, everyone would know what she had done. Eleanor had always been very concerned with her social image, with what others thought, and the threat of public scandal was the final blow. She took the documents with hands trembling with rage, read every page slowly while we all waited in silence, and finally, with hatred in her eyes, looking directly at me, she signed. Robert signed too, and so did Luke. Beatrice, after hesitating, also signed. And that was it. It was done. The inheritance would be distributed according to the original will. I collected all the signed documents and said I would deliver them to the lawyer to handle the registration and legal proceedings. Eleanor stood up from the table without a word and went to her room. Beatrice ran after her to comfort her, but Robert and Luke stayed. Robert came to me and gave me a tight hug, thanking me for having the courage to do what they hadn't. Jessica also approached with tears in her eyes and said she was proud of me. Then Luke pulled me to a more private corner of the house, and for the first time in years, I saw real emotion in his eyes. He was crying. He said he was ashamed, that he didn't know the situation was so serious, that he had been a coward all these years. I told him he now had a chance to change, to finally be the man I had married hoping he would be, but that it was up to him, to the choices he made from now on. He asked if I was going to leave him, if our marriage was over. I said I didn't know, that I needed time to think, to see if he would really change, or if this was just another empty promise. We left that house that day, leaving a battlefield behind. Eleanor, confused, trying to process everything, Robert and Jessica finally seeing a hope of freedom, and Luke, with me in the car in silence, processing everything that had happened. In the days that followed, things began to move quickly. Mr. Miller handled all the legal procedures. The properties were appraised, the accounts were opened, and within weeks, the money began to be transferred to the individual accounts of the three siblings. Each received a significant amount, not enough to retire on, but enough to have independence, to make decisions without fear. Luke used part of his money to finally start the engineering firm he had always dreamed of, without needing to ask for permission or approval from anyone. Robert was able to invest in improvements for his house and enroll his children in better schools. Even Beatrice, though still close to her mother, had to admit it was nice to have her own money, her own security. And Eleanor, well, she stayed in her house with her anger and her wounded pride. She tried a few times to call her children, using emotional blackmail, but the financial dependency had been broken, and with it, her power to manipulate. Robert stopped answering her calls. Luke started setting clear boundaries. Even Beatrice reduced her visits. The family that once gathered every Sunday religiously at Eleanor's house simply stopped doing so. Each began to live their own life, to build their own traditions. As for Luke and me, well, that was a story still being written. Breaking Eleanor's control was just the first step. The second step was to rebuild our marriage on new, healthy foundations, or to accept that perhaps it was too late for that. But at least now, it was a choice I was making, with power, with dignity, and no longer as a victim with no options. In the months that followed, Luke really began to change. He started therapy on his own, began working to understand the toxic patterns he had learned in childhood, began to truly listen to me when I talked about my feelings, and for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I felt that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for us. The 3 months that followed that explosive lunch were the most intense and transformative of my life. It was during this period that the true consequences of my actions began to unfold in ways I couldn't have imagined. Exposing Eleanor's crimes was just the beginning. What came next was even more devastating for her and more liberating for all of us. It all started when Robert, finally free from his mother's financial control, decided to investigate more deeply into what exactly had been done with the inheritance money over all those years. He hired a forensic accountant, one of those specialists who uncover fraud and embezzlement, and what this professional found went beyond anything any of us had expected. Eleanor hadn't just withheld the inheritance, she had used the money criminally. She had taken out loans in the name of the estate for close friends who never paid them back, sold 2 smaller properties, and pocketed the money without officially registering the transactions, and used funds that should have been in trust to pay for lavish renovations on her house and luxury international trips. When Robert showed me the accountant's report with all the suspicious transactions detailed, pages and pages of evidence of mismanagement and embezzlement, I knew this went beyond a family feud. This was a real crime, the kind that could land Eleanor in jail. Robert was determined to see it through. He said his mother had to answer legally for what she did, that it wasn't just about the money, it was about justice, about years of manipulation and abusive control. Luke was torn. Even after everything, even knowing his mother had lied to him and stolen from him, there was still a part of him that wanted to protect her. We had our first serious fight since the day of the birthday. I told him he needed to pick a side once and for all, that he couldn't sit on the fence. He yelled that it was easy for me to say, that she wasn't my mother. I yelled back that his mother had humiliated me for years and he had never defended me, that now that there were finally real consequences, he wanted to back down. That night was terrible. He slept on the couch, I cried in the bedroom. But the next morning, he came into the room with red eyes and said he had been thinking all night, that he had called his therapist in the middle of the night for an emergency session, and that he had realized he was still under his mother's psychological control. Even without the money, she still had power over him through guilt and emotional manipulation. He knew that if he didn't support the legal action against her, he would never be truly free, never be the man he wanted to be, the husband I deserved. So he called Robert and told him he was with him, that they would do what needed to be done. It was in that moment that I knew my husband was really changing, that for the first time he was choosing to do the right thing, even though it was the hard thing. Robert filed the lawsuit the following week. It wasn't just a collection suit, it was a criminal complaint for aggravated embezzlement. When Eleanor was notified, when a process server knocked on her door and served her the summons, she went into a full-blown panic. She called Luke dozens of times that day, leaving tearful messages, angry messages, manipulative messages, saying her sons were killing her, that after everything she had done for them, raising them alone after their father died, sacrificing her life for them, now they were suing her as if she were a common criminal. But Luke didn't answer the calls. He temporarily blocked her number on his therapist's advice that he needed the space. Beatrice, the favorite daughter, was the only one who remained by Eleanor's side. But even she was different. She was demanding explanations, wanting to know why her mother had done it. Eleanor couldn't give satisfactory answers, only repeating that she had done everything for her children, that they didn't understand, that they were being influenced by me, that it was all my fault. In a difficult conversation with me a few weeks later, Beatrice admitted that she had always known there was something wrong with the way her mother controlled everything, but that it had been easier to pretend not to see, to accept the benefits and not ask questions. She now felt guilty for having been a silent accomplice for so long. The case moved forward quickly because the evidence was irrefutable. The forensic accountant testified, the documents I had found were presented, and Eleanor's lawyer, an old family friend who was doing the job somewhat out of obligation, privately admitted to Mr. Miller that her case was indefensible. The most he could do was try for a settlement to reduce the penalties. And that's exactly what happened. After 2 months of proceedings, with Eleanor seeing her reputation publicly destroyed as details of the case began to leak out in the community, at the church she attended, among the friends at her club, and realizing she was going to lose anyway, she finally agreed to a settlement. The agreement stipulated that she had to return all the money she had improperly used, with interest and adjustments, which meant she would have to sell the house she lived in, the very symbol of her power, of the control she wielded over everyone. In addition, she had to sign a document formally admitting to the mismanagement of the assets, which would be permanently on record. And, as part of the deal to avoid actual prison time, she had to submit to community service and mandatory psychological counseling. The day the judge ratified that agreement is a day I will never forget. We were all in the courtroom. Me, Luke, Robert, Jessica, even Beatrice was there. Eleanor entered the room accompanied by her lawyer, and she was a completely different woman from the arrogant, controlling person I knew. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in 3 months. Her hair, always impeccably styled, was drab. Her clothes, always elegant and expensive, were simple. She didn't look at any of us, keeping her eyes down the entire time. When the judge asked if she understood the terms of the agreement and consented, she simply said, "Yes," in a barely audible voice. It was so different from all the times I had heard her yell, give orders, humiliate people, that for a brief moment I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered every humiliation she had put me through, every time Luke had stood silently while she destroyed me, every tear I had cried alone in the bathroom after those terrible lunches, and the pity vanished. When we left the courthouse, Robert was radiant. He hugged his wife and said he was finally free, truly free. Luke was quiet, thoughtful. In the car, he told me he didn't feel joy, but he felt relief. Relief that it was over, that clear boundaries had been set, that his mother would finally have to face the consequences of her actions. In the following weeks, Eleanor had to put her house up for sale. It was Beatrice who told me how devastating it was for her, how she cried while packing her things, how she tried until the very last moment to convince her sons to drop the case. But no one budged. She ended up moving into a small apartment in another neighborhood, far from the community where everyone knew who she was, where everyone had heard the rumors about the lawsuit. The money from the sale of the house was used to pay the debts from the settlement, and there was very little left for her. For the first time in her life, Eleanor had to live on a real budget, had to cut expenses, had to give up the luxurious lifestyle she had always had. The Sunday lunches, obviously, never happened again. The family that was once united by obligation and control simply fragmented. Everyone went their own way. Robert began to build a healthier relationship with his children, free from their grandmother's toxic influence. Jessica started to smile genuinely again after years. Beatrice slowly began to distance herself from her mother as well, as she recognized patterns of manipulation she hadn't seen before. And Luke? Well, Luke was transforming. Therapy was helping him untangle years of psychological conditioning, to understand how the family dynamic had shaped him in damaging ways. He was learning to be vulnerable with me, to really listen, to be a true partner. There was a day, about 4 months after that explosive birthday lunch, when Eleanor asked Luke to visit her at her new apartment. He asked me if I thought he should go. I told him the decision was his, that I would support whatever choice he made, but that if he went, he should go as an adult setting boundaries, not as a son seeking approval. He went. When he came back a few hours later, he told me everything. He said his mother was different, quieter, smaller somehow. She had tried at first to manipulate him with guilt, saying he had destroyed her, that her children had been cruel. But he hadn't fallen for it. He had told her calmly that she had made bad choices and was now living with the consequences. If she wanted to rebuild any kind of relationship with her children, she would need to start by admitting what she did wrong and offering a real apology, not a manipulative one, but a genuine one. Apparently, she wasn't ready for that yet, because she had changed the subject, talking about pleasantries, about the new apartment, about the community service she was doing at a charity as part of her sentence. Luke said it was strange to see her like that, stripped of all the power she'd always had. He realized in that moment that she had always been a deeply insecure and unhappy person, that she controlled others because she couldn't control her own life. He was sad for her, but not guilty, because he finally understood that he was not responsible for her happiness, that everyone is responsible for their own choices. When he told me this, I knew my husband had truly changed. He had grown up. He had become the man I always wanted him to be. And that night, for the first time in over a year, we made love for real. Not just mechanical, distant sex, but real connection, true intimacy. I cried afterward, not from sadness, but from relief, from hope, from gratitude that I had had the courage to fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Luke held me in his arms and told me he loved me, that he had been an idiot, that he had almost lost the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he would spend the rest of his life making up for the years he had been a coward. I believed him, not because I was being naive, but because he had proven through actions, not just words, that he was committed to changing. Mr. Miller called me a few days later to congratulate me on the outcome of the case. He said it was one of the most satisfying cases of his career, because it wasn't just about winning money or a lawsuit, it was about real justice, about freeing people from abuse. He said something that stuck with me. He said that victims of family abuse often never get out because they lack the resources, the information, or the courage. But I had all three. And I had used them not just to save myself, but to save the entire family. He said that was rare. When I hung up the phone, I sat down and truly reflected on the whole journey. From that terrible night when the plate broke and I finally saw the truth, to this moment of relative peace and rebuilding. I realized I was no longer that scared woman who accepted crumbs of respect and dignity. I had become someone strong, someone who knew her worth, someone who was not afraid to fight for what was right. And that transformation hadn't happened because Luke changed or because Eleanor was defeated. It had happened because I chose to change, chose to no longer be a victim, chose to reclaim my power. And that was something no one could ever take from me again. Today, 2 years after that lunch that changed everything, I look back and barely recognize the woman I was. That insecure woman who accepted being humiliated, who cried alone in the bathroom, who had completely lost her essence trying to please people who would never value her. When I look in the mirror now, I see someone completely different, someone strong, confident, someone who knows exactly who she is and what she deserves. This transformation wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was real and profound, and it changed not only my life, but the lives of everyone involved in that toxic family dynamic. Starting with Luke and I, our marriage today is unrecognizable compared to what it was. We went to couples therapy for a whole year. Weekly sessions where we dug up years of resentment, hurt, and frustration, where we learned to truly communicate, where Luke finally understood how much his silence, his cowardice had hurt me, and where I learned to express my needs without the fear of being called dramatic or overreacting. It was a painful process. There were sessions where I wanted to give up, where I thought it was too late, that the damage was too great to be repaired. But we persisted, and slowly, session by session, we began to rebuild not the marriage we had, but a completely new one based on mutual respect, honest communication, and true partnership. Luke has changed in ways I never thought possible. He's still in individual therapy to this day, working through deep-seated issues from his childhood, understanding how Eleanor's control shaped his inability to set boundaries and defend the people he loves. He has become a present husband, a man who asks me how my day was and actually listens to the answer, who shares household chores with me without my having to ask, who not only defends me from external attacks, but also validates my feelings when I'm upset or insecure. The engineering firm he started with part of his inheritance is thriving. He has 5 employees now and projects all over the city. He tells me he only managed to succeed because he was finally free from the psychological weight of trying to please his mother, free to make his own decisions, free to be himself. We moved, too. We left that small rented apartment and bought a house. It's not huge or luxurious, but it's ours, truly ours, chosen by both of us together, decorated our way. And it's filled with light and laughter, things that were so absent in our old home. We decided to try for children again, and after a few attempts and a few scares, I got pregnant. This time was different. Luke was present for every doctor's appointment, held my hand at every ultrasound, read books on fatherhood, talked to my belly every night. When our daughter was born 6 months ago, a beautiful girl we named Laura, he cried like I've never seen a man cry. He is the most dedicated and present father I could ever imagine. He wakes up in the middle of the night to help with feedings, changes diapers without complaining, sings lullabies in that off-key voice of his that makes me laugh. When I see him with our daughter in his arms, I know we made the right choices, that it was worth the fight, worth not giving up. As for Robert and Jessica, they're also in a much better place. Robert used part of his inheritance to start his own consulting firm in his field, and Jessica finally fulfilled her dream of going back to school. She's taking psychology classes at night. She says she wants to help other women going through family abuse. The two of them renewed their wedding vows a year ago, a small, intimate ceremony with just close friends. It was emotional to see them looking into each other's eyes and making promises again, but this time as free people, no longer prisoners of a toxic family dynamic. Their children, my nephews, are flourishing too. Without their grandmother's negative influence, without hearing constant criticism and venomous comments, they are more secure, happier. Sometimes we get together, the 4 of us adults and the kids, for lunches or barbecues, and we've created our own family tradition, one based on support and love, not control and fear. Even Beatrice eventually woke up to reality. It took longer for her because she had been the favorite, the one who benefited most from the system. But about a year ago, she called me and asked if we could talk. When we met, she cried and apologized. She said she had been an accomplice to her mother's cruelty, that she had felt superior and had judged me unfairly, and that only after watching everything fall apart did she realize how sick that family dynamic was. We talked for hours, and I accepted her apology because I no longer carried any anger. I had processed it all and moved on. Today, we aren't close friends, but we have a cordial relationship. She is rebuilding her life too, went to therapy, set boundaries with her mother, and is raising her children differently, without that pressure for perfection and that sick need for control. And as for Eleanor, well, that's the most complex part. She continues to live alone in the small apartment. Her mandatory community service ended a year ago. She has tried a few times to reconnect with her children, especially when Laura was born. She sent a gift and a card, wanting to meet her granddaughter. But Luke and I talked it over, and we decided together that she could only have contact with our daughter if she demonstrated real change, not just words, but consistent actions over time. We set clear conditions. She would have to continue therapy on her own. She would have to genuinely apologize, not just to Luke, but also to me and to Robert and Jessica. And she would have to respect the boundaries we set about when and how she could see her granddaughter. Initially, she was outraged, said we were cruel, that she had a right to see her granddaughter. But Luke stood firm. He said it wasn't about rights, it was about earning it, about trust that needed to be rebuilt. After a few months of resistance, maybe because the loneliness was weighing on her, or maybe because she was really starting to reflect on everything, Eleanor gave in. She went back to therapy and asked to have a conversation with all of us. It was strange, 6 months ago, to gather in a neutral room, a public cafe where she had asked to meet us. She was different, not just physically older and more tired, but there was something in her eyes, something that could be genuine remorse or could just be more sophisticated manipulation. We're still not sure. But she apologized, and it wasn't the vague, defensive apology she used to give. She was specific. She said she had been controlling, abusive, that she had used money as a tool of manipulation, that she had treated her daughters-in-law like enemies instead of family, that she had failed as a mother by raising dependent sons instead of independent ones. She looked at me directly and said she was deeply sorry for every humiliation she had put me through, every cruel comment, every complicit silence she had forced upon Luke, and that she would understand if I could never forgive her. I was silent for a long moment, looking at the woman who had been my tormentor for so many years. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction at her downfall. I just felt a deep sadness for all the lost time, for all the relationships that could have been good but were destroyed by ego and control. I told her I accepted her apology, but that forgiveness is a process, not a single event. She would have to demonstrate consistent change over time. As for our daughter, she could mate her eventually, but always under supervision and following strict rules. She agreed. And since then, she has been trying, slowly, to rebuild some kind of relationship with her children. 3 months ago, she met Laura for the first time. It was a short visit, just 30 minutes in our backyard with Luke and me present the whole time. She held her granddaughter in her arms and cried. She said Laura was beautiful. She didn't make a single critical comment, didn't try to offer unsolicited advice on how to care for the baby. She just held her granddaughter and cried. Maybe there's hope for her, maybe not. Time will tell. But the important thing is, she no longer has power over us. She can't hurt us anymore because we have established solid boundaries and we hold them firmly. As for me, personally, I've gone back to school too. I'm doing a postgraduate program in educational psychology. I want to specialize in helping children who come from difficult family environments because I understand now how it affects a person, how it shapes who you become. I want to use my experience to help others. I still work as a teacher, but now with more purpose, with more compassion, because I see in my students the invisible wounds they carry from home, and I try to be for them the stable, welcoming presence every child deserves. I write too. I started a blog where I share my story anonymously, and I receive messages from women all over the world saying they can relate, that they are going through or have gone through similar situations. Knowing that my story can help others find the courage to change their own lives is incredibly rewarding. I've learned so many lessons in these 2 years. I've learned that you can't change other people. You can only change yourself and your reactions. I've learned that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's self-love. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse, it means freeing yourself from the weight of hatred. I've learned that marriages can be saved if both partners are genuinely committed to change, but I've also learned that it's okay to walk away if the other person isn't willing to do the work. I've learned that family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's respect, it's love shown through actions and not just words. And I've learned that I am so much stronger than I ever imagined. That inside me, this brave and determined woman always existed. She was just dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And today, when Laura looks at me with those curious baby eyes, I make a silent promise to her. I promise that I will raise her to be strong, to know her worth, to never accept being treated with disrespect. I promise I will teach her that it's possible to be both kind and firm, that it's possible to love and still set boundaries, that it's possible to forgive without forgetting, and that above all else, she deserves to be happy, deserves to be respected, deserves to be loved in the right way. When I look at Luke playing with our daughter, making silly faces that make her giggle, being the present and loving father he never had, I know that we've broken the cycle, that the dysfunction passed down through generations in his family stops with us, that Laura will grow up in a home filled with healthy love, honest communication, and respected boundaries. And that, more than any revenge, more than any legal victory, that is the true triumph, building something new and healthy from the ashes of what was destroyed. I am grateful. Grateful that I found courage when it seemed impossible, grateful for the people who supported me along the way, grateful even for the difficult times because they shaped me into who I am today. When I think of that woman in Eleanor's dining room with a broken plate at her feet, trembling with humiliation, I want to go back in time and tell her, hold on, you are stronger than you know. This will pass. You will survive. You will thrive. You will find your voice and your strength. And when you do, you will be amazed at what you are capable of, at the lives you are capable of changing, starting with your own. And today, sitting in the garden of my home, with my daughter asleep in her stroller beside me, with my husband inside preparing lunch and singing off-key as always, with the sun warming my face and a deep sense of peace in my heart, I can finally say with total honesty and conviction, I am happy, truly happy, and no one will ever take that away from me again. And now, I want to hear from you, the person on the other side of the screen, because I know that many of you identified with parts of this story. Maybe you're living through something similar right now. Maybe you have an in-law who treats you badly. Maybe you have a partner who doesn't defend you when they should. Maybe you're trapped in a toxic family dynamic and don't know how to get out. Or maybe you've already been through it and managed to overcome it. And if that's the case, I would love to hear your story too, because every story of overcoming inspires other people to find their own strength. So tell me in the comments below, have you been through something similar? What was your experience like? What did you do to change the situation? Or if you're still going through it, how are you feeling? What's stopping you from acting? And know that there's no judgment here. This is a supportive community where we all understand the complexity of these situations. We understand it's not easy to just leave or confront, that there are layers of emotion, dependency, fear, and hope that make everything much more complicated than it looks from the outside. I also want to ask a specific question that I know a lot of people will have an opinion on. Do you think I should allow Eleanor to have more contact with my daughter? Do you think people can really change? Or do you believe it's once an abuser, always an abuser? Because this is a question I still struggle with internally sometimes, especially when I see her making a genuine effort, but also remembering everything she did. So leave your opinion down below. I read all the comments, and they often help me see things from different perspectives. And also, if you know someone who is going through a similar situation, someone who is being disrespected in a family or marital relationship, please share this video with them because sometimes all a person needs is to see that there is a way out, that other people have made it through, that it is indeed possible to reclaim your dignity and build a better life. And before I finish, I need to talk about something very important, something that was fundamental in my journey and that could be fundamental in yours too. Throughout this difficult process, during the darkest moments when I thought I couldn't make it, when the pain was so great it felt unbearable, it was my faith in God that sustained me. It was knowing that I wasn't alone, that there was a greater purpose even in the suffering, that there was a strength greater than me guiding and strengthening me. I know you may not be religious, maybe you have a complicated relationship with faith, but I encourage you, if you are going through a difficult time, if you identified with my story, seek spiritual guidance. Open your heart to God. Allow Jesus Christ to come into your life and show you the way, because I couldn't have done it alone. It was through prayer, through connecting with something bigger than my circumstances, that I found the strength to keep going. And also, seek out a community of faith, a church, a prayer group, people who can support you spiritually and emotionally. Because real, lasting transformation doesn't just come from external action, but from internal renewal. And that renewal comes when you connect with the divine, when you hand over your pain, your fears, your anxieties to God, and trust that He has a better plan for you than you can even imagine. And I testify that this is true because I've lived it, because I've seen in my own life how faith transformed me, how it gave me courage when I wanted to give up, how it gave me wisdom to make difficult decisions, how it gave me compassion to forgive when it was easier to hate. I'm not saying you need the same faith I have or that you need to attend the same church. I'm just saying there is power in connecting with the sacred, with the transcendent, with that which is greater than us. And if you are seeking real change in your life, I invite you to take that step of faith too, to not try to do it all alone, but to seek strength where it can truly be found, in God, in Jesus Christ, in a community of people who will support you and love you unconditionally. And I pray for every person who has watched this video to the end. I pray especially for those who are suffering right now, who are in situations of abuse or disrespect. I pray that God touches their hearts, gives them the courage to act, the wisdom to know what to do, and the strength to move forward even when it seems impossible. And I also pray for those who cause the suffering, the Eleanors of this world, because deep down, they are also wounded people who need healing, who need transformation. And only God can do that deep work of renewing a heart. So, if you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me, for having the patience to hear my entire story, for being part of this incredible community we are building together. Don't forget to leave a like, to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to hit the notification bell to be notified of the next videos. And most importantly, don't forget to comment, to share your story or your opinion, because it's that exchange that makes all of this meaningful, that transforms a simple video into a real conversation between real people who are all just trying to navigate the complexities of life and relationships. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourself, set your boundaries, know your worth, and never, ever accept being treated with less respect than you deserve. Because you are valuable, you are strong, you are capable of incredible things, even if you don't know it yet. Goodbye with love, and may God bless you abundantly.